It's my great pleasure to announce the new speaker, the next speaker. Her name is JAE SEVELIUS. She is a licensed clinical psychologist. She works in the university, in the Department of Medicine at the University of California in San Francisco, UCSF, at the Center of Excellence for Transgender Health. So JAE has is very discreet about her qualifications, but basically she's a badass researcher that holds a lot of NIDA big money grants and has done, research dialoguing with transgender communities and women of color, and very much based on community orientation. And she has been presenting recently in the field of psychedelics, and that's not the major part of her work, but she's trying to intersect the discussions around social justice, the social justice movement, and gender issues, and all the discussion about transgender and sexual minorities, and the field of psychedelic science. She has done 2 recent writings in our site in Chikrunanet and presented also in our conference, and she has been sparkling some really good conversations. So it's my great pleasure to introduce her lecture, Psychedelic Justice, Exploring the Intersections of Healing, Liberation, and Social Change. Please welcome JAE to the stage.
It's such an honor to be here. Thank you so much, Horizons, for having me. We've had such an inspiring conference so far, hearing from the luminaries of the science and our communities. And there's so much hope in the questions we're asking. And we really need some hope right now. I need some hope. And I see how these medicines might address some of the most intractable mental health problems faced by individuals today. Depression, PTSD, even race-based trauma and addiction. And as we heard in yesterday's presentations, science has advanced tremendously since the first wave of Western psychedelic science. We now understand the importance of randomization, of control groups, and clearly defined measures of our outcomes. We now have the technology to conduct fMRIs and other types of brain scans to understand the mechanisms behind our observations. Psychedelic science has also intentionally worked hard to improve its respectability as a science in the mainstream. Researchers have even lopped off their ponytails and made sure not to wear any tie-dye to our professional association conferences. But as a community, we're starting to see some of the initial consequences of going mainstream in the climate of our current culture. We're starting to wonder about who exactly this science is intended to serve. I'm interested in the social implications of the current trajectory of the science, and I think that interest is growing. We're having tremendous success with demonstrating the efficacy of psychedelics for individual healing among a certain group of people. Now is the time to start expanding our lines of thinking and explore ideas about how to harness the power of psychedelics for social change. Is psychedelic science helping us address the conditions that create trauma, or are we really just interested in treating the symptoms? I want to ask you all a few questions that you can answer just by raising your hand, and I want you to be honest. How many of you are interested in this field because you think you will make a lot of money? How many of you are interested in psychedelics because you see the healing potential for the clients or patients you work with, or for yourself? Okay. And how many of you are interested because you think psychedelics could improve or benefit our society as a whole? All right. That's great. In this talk, I'd like to start expanding our attention out from the individual level conversation How do we heal people's experiences of trauma on a person-by-person, individual basis, and try to broaden it to a conversation about exploring the potential for collective healing. First, I want to acknowledge with so much gratitude the tremendous amount of thinking and work that has already been going on into fostering these dialogues. There are so many of us here in this room that have been putting tremendous energy into turning up the volume on these issues. Thank you. I just happen to be the one with the microphone at the moment, so I'm hoping to do justice to representing the larger conversations that have already been happening in our communities. So just for some context, as Bia said, I'm a clinical research psychologist working in academic medicine. It's a large medical school, a huge research institution, and I intimately understand the challenges of conducting clinical research and trying to think about systemic change at the same time. It's a really difficult tension to try to navigate. So at UCSF, I lead federally funded research addressing health disparities among transgender communities. And our team's research is focused on issues that especially impact trans people of color, special emphasis on HIV and incarceration. So we explore ways to increase access to healthcare for trans people by looking critically at the places where social justice and health intersect. So my interest in psychedelic science began to deepen several years ago when I saw the incredible potential to heal trauma, since trauma is such a foundational aspect of my daily work with trans people. I completed the certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapies and research at the California Institute for Integral Studies, and in my education about the current state of psychedelic science, I noticed that so far, psychedelic science as a whole largely doesn't even acknowledge the most pervasive forms of trauma that result from systems of oppression. I believe our movement, and the people here in this room especially, want collective healing for all of us, not just the privileged few. Research and medicine can be tools of liberation, but not necessarily. Ultimately, they're just tools. They reflect the spoken and unspoken agendas of the people that wield them. I love this quote from Daniel Dennett in Darwin's Dangerous Idea. There's no such thing as philosophy-free science. There is only science whose philosophical baggage is taken on board without examination. So, just as for a historical example, in the 1960s, Ram Dass, who at the time was Richard Alpert, his early research with LSD explored its use as a conversion therapy for gay men, meaning he attempted to use LSD as a way to cure homosexuality. This research question was shaped during a time when homosexuality was viewed as a mental illness and as a learned behavior that can and should be extinguished. So how are our times shaping our research questions today? In today's research, when decisions are made about what types of traumas to treat, how to approach the treatment, or which populations should be prioritized in our science, there is a political context informing those decisions. Science is constantly being shaped by social forces, assumptions, funding, and legal contexts. Our values, whether we realize it or not, shape the scientific questions we ask, the ways that we design our research, how we interpret the conclusions, and who we intend to serve. We reflect and we replicate those values in our science. And this doesn't mean that the questions we're asking so far don't deserve to be asked, but we do need to be intentional and upfront about what our values are, so we can be clear about which types of research questions we are prioritizing and why. Different values generate different questions, and so often in research, those values go unspoken or unacknowledged. So The idea that different values generate different research questions, which in turn generate different types of knowledge, was originally introduced in the 60s by Habermas, who was a German philosopher and critical theorist. So he broke it down like this. He said technical questions, and in the field of psychedelic science, would be, what are the effects of psychedelics on the brain? This is a critical question because it helps advance the foundation of our science. But those answers don't necessarily tell us what the implications of our findings are or what to do with them. Interpretive questions can help us understand the implications of our technical findings. They help us generate hypotheses about our observations so we can create theories that help guide us in how we apply those findings. So, for example, we can hypothesize about the importance of mystical experiences during psychedelic therapy, or we can look at other cultures and interpret what they're doing to try and inform our own practices. Emancipatory questions are interested in human liberation. Questions such as, how can psychedelics help us address the root causes of trauma? Can psychedelics help people not only cope with past traumas, such as healing PTSD, but can they help us cope with the types of ongoing, continuous traumas that many of us face, such as racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia? How might psychedelics foster resilience so that we can all stay engaged in creating the social change we want to see? How can psychedelics help us to be more ethical, more loving, bring more justice into the world? And then an integrated approach could help us reimagine what truly multidisciplinary psychedelic sciences are capable of achieving. So the brain has been described as a reducing valve or a prediction machine, which makes it very difficult to see things in a new way or expand our vision of what's possible. And so you combine this with our deep social programming, especially the kind we are unaware of, and it becomes clear why we so often can't see past the limits of our particular framework. We've learned that psychedelics can help each of our brains on an individual level open up by interrupting old thought patterns that don't serve us, and that's called disruption of the default mode network of the brain. Can psychedelics help us collectively see past our social programming and imagine new ways of being? Can we disrupt our cultural default mode network on a collective level? The default mode network of our culture is infused with patterns of privilege and oppression, which manifest in ways that look like violence, exclusion, cultural appropriation, and capitalist greed. It's the same old, well-worn path. Interrupting these patterns in order to take a crazy new path requires deep, deep cultural humility. Cultural humility is the acknowledgement that we are often ignorant of our own privileges. It's about being humble about what we don't know and being open to learning. If we are going to leverage this science to transform and improve the social conditions of our society, we must wake up to the ways in which this science needs more diverse voices to teach us, to lead us, and to fund us. The boards of the primary funding organizations, as well as the heads of scientific teams, are comprised primarily of white men. White men make up only about 30% of the US population, yet they comprise over 95% of the boards of the major funding organizations of psychedelic science. So whose agenda do you think is being discussed and prioritized? We also know from Dr. Monica Williams' talk yesterday that there is a serious problem with the exclusion of participants of color, or even serious consideration of their unique issues in studies of psychedelic therapies. We have not even started to consider the representation of sexual and gender minorities in psychedelic science because we haven't yet begun asking those questions. This is despite the fact that people of color, queer, and trans people experience trauma at much higher rates than the general population. So you can see that lack of diverse expertise informing study designs and therapy models often results in narrow frameworks. So far, this has unnecessarily limited the generalizability of our findings to the white, straight, cisgender population. And in order to be generalizable, we must be able to demonstrate that these therapies are applicable to different types of people. Otherwise, we are merely testing a highly specific therapy that is only accessible to an exclusive subpopulation under very narrow conditions. And we cannot know or address what the barriers are to participation for different groups when those voices are not at the table. We can infer from other clinical trials in medicine that distrust is likely a big factor. Historically, marginalized communities have long histories of being abused, manipulated, and treated unethically within the context of medical research. We also know that communities of color have been devastated by the war on drugs and subsequent mass incarceration. They have much more at stake when asked by researchers to participate in studies that involve illegal substances. We know that medical research has also enacted countless traumas against sexual and gender minorities. We must first bring justice to our own psychedelic communities on this smaller scale if we expect to somehow change society with psychedelics. Our communities represent a microcosm of what is happening on a social level in this country, and perhaps one could argue even globally. Unfortunately, the mainstreaming of psychedelics requires that we make it clear that we are aligned with the agendas of white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. The medicalization agenda must not aim, or even appear to aim, to disrupt any existing hierarchies or value systems currently upheld by our government, lest the government perceive our science to be a threat to the status quo. For me, speaking for myself here, maybe some other people in the audience, I don't know. This is exemplified by MAPS accepting a $1 million donation from the Mercer Family Foundation. Thanks for some support with that. Thank you. You know, just to provide some context, the Mercer Family Foundation owns large stakes in several conservative think tanks and highly racist alt-right groups, including Breitbart, the Heritage Foundation. They gave $25 million to the Trump campaign in 2016. They financially backed illegal data mining through Cambridge Analytica, playing a major role in his election. And you don't have to agree with me, but I do think that by saying we're taking psychedelics out of the political realm, we're also saying we are not going to be actively engaged with challenging any of the existing power structures. So, capitalist tactics might be the way to go for some people. But I also see the capitalist tactic of cultural appropriation alive and well in our movement. And for-profit companies like Compass, for example, are mining the knowledge, connections, and resources of people who have been doing this work for decades, exploiting their generosity, and then using resources to benefit their quest for profit. And yes, that's a way to scale things up. Cultural appropriation is about gaining access to a culture outside of your own and then using the tools and wisdoms that it developed for your own capital gain without ever connecting it back to the culture that produced it. So we're also seeing the impact of the Me Too movement in psychedelic communities, where women are speaking out about their experiences of sexual abuse. Not because the phenomenon is new in psychedelic spaces, but because these abuses have been happening since the beginning of time. And at this moment, there is a platform, a collective sense of solidarity to speak from. And this is reflective of systemic issues of power dynamics that we've all been socialized to ignore and thereby reinforce. Collectively, I believe that we must listen to women when they come forward with stories of sexual abuse and harassment. We must listen and respond when women, people of color, queer people, and trans people say they don't feel safe or included in psychedelic communities. Thank you. We must notice and act when those voices are absent. And we must each ask ourselves if and how we are prepared to examine or leverage or give up our privilege to ensure that the people who most need this healing are not the ones being left behind. There really is so much room to imagine radical healing possibilities within the context of these medicines. Dr. Monica Williams presented her pioneering work yesterday that is not only aiming to diversify the participants in the phase 3 clinical trials, but is also generating new and different questions about how to serve people who need this access to healing. Questions that would not have been asked without her team's unique insights and connections to community. And because of my research in transgender health, I'm also excited to think about the possibilities for working with some of the issues faced by trans and gender nonconforming communities. Much of my research focuses on the absolute imperative of access to gender-affirming healthcare for trans people, such as hormones and surgeries, in order to improve mental health outcomes. Often, though, even with access to healthcare, many trans and gender nonconforming folks still experience this intractable dissatisfaction with the body. Trans people can also experience a deep internalized sense of stigma around the trans experience itself. This can and does lead to severe depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, and self-harm. And substance use as a form of coping is also really high among trans people. Psychedelics can remind us that we are not our bodies. This is a fundamental aspect of the ego dissolution experience. Psychedelics can help us see beyond the binaries and increase our comfort with complexity and ambiguity. What if psychedelic-assisted therapy could increase self-acceptance among sexual and gender minorities, increase one's level of comfort in their body, and build our sense of being affirmed from within? Perhaps building these inner resources could increase one's ability to cope with the ongoing traumas of transphobia in the context of our current society. I'm excited about generating new research ideas to increase safe access to these medicines. And I believe we are at a crossroads in our movement, a place where we get to decide where we want to align ourselves with history. In the ideal world for many of us, the legacy of psychedelics could be one of liberation. But for that to happen, those with power and privilege must also be willing to make the changes necessary to allow new perspectives and ideas to be expressed, welcomed, and acted upon. Change requires true commitment to go beyond the superficial tokenization of voices that are often excluded or silenced. It requires truly valuing and affirming diverse types of expertise when envisioning the future of this field. This is called collaborative ideation. Collaborative ideation is the idea that the more people who co-create the future, the more people whose concerns will be addressed at a foundational level. Collaborative ideation is about proactively establishing our values and practices as a community in order to resist abuse and oppression and encourage safety, support, and accountability in the ways that Annie Oak discussed this morning. But this requires all of our efforts. It's not the responsibility of people of color to abolish racism, just like it's not the responsibility of trans people to abolish transphobia or the responsibility of women to eliminate sexism and sexual abuse. The idea of collaborative ideation requires that we collectively envision the world that we want to live in. This means that we all must be willing to proactively speak up about our values and change the way we do things. We have to ask ourselves what we are willing to do and what we have to offer to the movement to create true change. The concept of collaborative ideation can be expanded to our research methods. It's not just enough to try to recruit diverse populations into studies that have been designed by straight white people for straight white people. We need research that is truly grounded in our communities with full participation by the communities themselves. Community-engaged research is not a new idea. It's a methodology that's rooted in the popular education movement started by Paulo Freire. And it involves a partnership approach to research, involving collaboration between researchers and community members at all stages of the research process. In this way, it can leverage diverse types of expertise and put the emphasis on equity, improving the well-being of the community, and results in shared decision-making, even shared decision-making about funding, and joint ownership of the results and how meaningful the results are to the community. We need more transparency in how funding decisions are made. I can't imagine doing my own research with trans communities outside of this approach, because the aim is to conduct research that is meaningful to the communities it's meant to serve. One fundamental aspect of community-engaged research is the creation of and collaboration with community advisory boards to help inform the research questions and the methodologies. So I'd like to propose that all of the major entities funding or conducting psychedelic research create and engage a community advisory board comprised of people from the communities the research is meant to serve. And there are some existing examples of how community-engaged research can be done in psychedelic science. I'm very privileged to be working with Dr. Brian Anderson at UCSF on his psilocybin study with long-term AIDS survivors. Before the study even began, the team was working closely with existing community groups to get their input and to engage them in the research before they even started recruitment. I also have much admiration for Dr. Alicia Danforth and Dr. Charlie Grobe's study of MDMA with autistic people. I've seen Dr. Danforth operate with a great deal of intention around working with a key consultant and advocate for autistic people to ensure that the language they use is respectful of the community they are working with and that they are fully informed of the issues that should be considered in designing and interpreting the research. And of course, so much admiration for Dr. Monica Williams and her team, who are incredible pioneers. They're doing a tremendous job building a program of research led by people of color to work with communities of color. And the training program for therapists of color that they are proposing, I believe, really has the potential to start to break open this field so the work that needs to be done and access to the healing benefits are available to more people. So, if you're making donations, consider the training for therapists of color. Monica Williams' team really believe in that project. No doubt there are many other examples of this being well done in psychedelic research, and I would love for there to be a place for us to talk about these community-engaged approaches and observe systematically the impact on the resulting research. The idea of building movements and promoting social justice-centered perspectives on science has strong roots in a group that was formed in the 60s called Science for the People. It was a non-hierarchical, radical group of scientists and activists that sought to resist the militarization of scientific research and the corporate control of research agendas. Science for the People is being revitalized today as these fundamental questions of power and ideology are still pervasive in science. This idea is starting to inspire our own movement. Psychedelics for the People. I had this really cool font, this cool psychedelic font that didn't translate, but you get the idea. So it's up to us to create alternative conversations. Instead of just calling each other out, let's create spaces to find each other and participate. Psychedelic justice is about creating alternatives rather than perpetually recreating the system. I imagine Psychedelics for the People as a non-hierarchical movement of scientists, activists, and community members who believe that psychedelic science should be a movement for justice, for humanity, and for the planet. We can work together to figure out how to effectively secure safe access to these healing medicines for all of the people, not just some. This requires inviting and embracing critique and self-reflection through the practice of cultural humility. We must resist science that serves corporate profit and military domination. We must actively oppose racism and white supremacy. And we must establish platforms of communication for scientists and activists to develop research, strategies, and tactics to achieve social justice-oriented goals. I'm a big Adrienne Marie Brown fan. Read her book, Emergent Strategy, changed my life. She says decolonization of the imagination is the most dangerous and subversive form there is, for it is where all other forms of decolonization are born. Once the imagination is unshackled, liberation is limitless. Individual healing and collective liberation are fundamentally intertwined. We are all socialized into a paradigm that privileges some ways of knowing over others. We all need to do the work of re-examining our cultural programming. This is not personal. This is not about any particular white people or straight people or men. This is a collective experience and a collective responsibility. This is about the need for psychedelic science as a movement to acknowledge and resist the replication of existing structures of power and oppression, especially in the name of science. Thank you.
How does one go about confronting the silencing that is almost immediate and the blacklisting and the pushback you get from the community and people in leadership that always has happened historically when anyone stands up for something related to justice? Like, what is your recommendation to us on the ground?
Well, I really liked what Annie Oak was saying earlier about really creating, kind of close-knit, smaller local spaces, and really cultivating that community where you are. Although I also, I share her reservations about social media, but I do think that there are ways to connect with people all over the country and really all over the world who will listen. And I do believe in keep talking, keep speaking up, keep speaking your truth. And there will be some people who won't want to listen, and there will be some people who do listen. And just keep making those connections. You will find support. And I think there are more and more of us who are interested in the concept of psychedelic justice, and we have to find each other.
Are there any examples of other drugs that have been funded with the non-for-profit model that we can kind of use as an example moving forward with psychedelics?
I think HIV treatment is a really good example. AIDS activists did a lot of really, really intense, really hard work during the AIDS epidemic to make sure that people had safe and affordable and free access to the treatment that they needed. I really encourage all of us to get educated about the history of AIDS activism and access to HIV treatment, and there's a really beautiful model there about grassroots activism ensuring safe and free access to treatments that people need.
I wanted to follow up on the first question. I don't want to speak for Oriana, but I feel like she was driving towards getting your opinion on what the appropriate kind of methods for activism are in a space where you feel a lot of pushback and it's hard to break through, and how disruptive one should be, or that kind of question, I think, is what a lot of people around are asking themselves these days. So.
I mean, I tend to fall in a little bit, I would say, on the radical side of this. I think there's room for all of it. Yeah.
There's been a lot of talk about racism and sexism in this weekend, and this might be a little bit too far in the future, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about classism and how to scale this up in the future for low-income individuals, because like a psychedelic therapy session is usually like 8 hours, sometimes a whole day, and a lot of people don't have that sort of time to get sort of therapies like that.
It's an intersectional issue, right? Because as Monica's pointed out in her presentation yesterday, people of color, systematically make less money, earn less money, accumulate less wealth. Women get paid less than men. Queer and trans people are vastly underemployed. And so I really see it as sort of this intersectional thing, that when we're talking about people who can't afford the treatments, we're disproportionately talking about people of color and women. And so I don't see them as separate issues. But there are a lot of smart people in this movement who can figure out how to make this affordable. It's, do we have the political will to do that? Or will we serve the corporate agenda? The solutions are there. We just need to find them. There's a lot of people in this room who can figure out how to do that.